Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Critical Perspectives. And of course, as usual, Vanessa and I have been very busy, but we're hopefully getting back to doing these more often because the news cycle unfortunately requires it. And I do feel a sort of camaraderie with Vanessa here because I think people are losing their minds, especially Vanessa, me being here on this side of the pond, on this side of the world. The infiltration of the information that comes in, or you could say like the lack of filtering that comes in through the algorithms on X or on any social media is just really terrible. It's just you get like the lowest form of information, of news, and I've just been inundated with constant talk about Charlie Kirk and who killed him and all of these theories surrounding that, and everybody's talking about the same thing and they're not paying attention to the reality of the world that's happening behind them. And of course, unfortunately, yesterday was October 7th, what people call the anniversary of the genocide of Gaza. This is when everything started, but what Israel has taken, of course, as the beginning of this devastation that they experienced with the attacks on the Nova Festival by Hamas, and that this is when Hamas unleashed this wrath that nobody had ever seen upon poor Israelis. That narrative has, of course, largely been entirely destroyed by the facts and by what we have seen on our screens for 2 years now. For me, the whole 2 year thing is shameful. It's shameful that we are 2 years in and people are still trying to monetize the suffering of Palestinians, trying to monetize the Holocaust that we've seen, trying to really use it for discussions on debates on YouTube and these sorts of things. And yet nothing has stopped it. We just saw the flotilla be, of course, seized. It was the largest flotilla in a long time. There were people there that were there for the right reasons. But the thing is, again, we ultimately knew this was how it was going to end, with no aid delivered to Palestinians, or very little aid, with the attention, of course, being diverted again from Gaza into maybe perhaps well-meaning activists. Again, this has been the reoccurring thing. Nothing has changed. We still have powerful world governments, China, Russia, even South Africa, continue to have relationships with Israel. We still have the Trump administration really doing theatrical displays of fights with Netanyahu, which people buy hook, line, and sinker, in order to say that Trump is turning on Israel, that the United States is turning on Israel, that they're separate from Israel. We have this Kirk narrative being there to promote this idea that the United States is separate from Israel, which is a major narrative that's promoting, that the United States is a victim to Israel rather than a completely complicit as it is. And so these are some of the things that have been on my mind, specifically in regard to that, not the story itself of the whole Kirk thing, but rather how it's being used to distract from the realities of an impending false flag on Iran via the United States. We've seen Netanyahu come out and talk about how Iran has the capability to attack Mar-a-Lago, where Trump resides, New York, cities in the United States, and how this is happening and it's going to happen and we need to stop it. It does seem like the United States and a lot of people, eminent journalists and people who are considered political analysts, are discussing, are completely distracted by the superfluous things instead of what's actually going on. And this is why I want to start off by having you talk about the one thing that has also been irritating me, is the focus on this Trump peace plan as the greatest thing on earth. Again, we're seeing this repetition of Trump is doing this, as of course the Nobel Peace Prize thing is coming to turn, right? This is all, the timing of these things is always very fun to look at. And so I want your take on that, because so many reportings have said that Hamas gave up, that Hamas is just giving in to what Donald Trump wants, that Donald Trump is actually in a fight with Bibi Netanyahu, and that he's trying to go after Israel, that Israel's fall is happening tomorrow, that Israel is done, that Israel is finished, that the entire Western Empire is finished. I want your take on this peace plan that Trump has been going on about.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, and we were talking about this the other day, there's a huge amount of misinformation being fed to, as we know, a relatively gullible public from media outlets like Al Jazeera, which of course is Qatari, and Al Arabiya, and all of the Al Hadath, and all of that, all the Saudi journals saying, first of all, they were saying Hamas has agreed to disarm, which of course is total nonsense. That's the one major sticking point, really, although the entire 20-point plan has, in my opinion, it's really no deviation from the previous plans that we've talked about. The only difference is how, in my opinion, it's now being frighteningly ramped up to be this kind of, groundbreaking, massive peace deal that Trump has brought into effect, remembering, of course, that he also brought peace to Albania and Azerbaijan, but I mean, that's beside the point.
Potential peace deal for the Middle East. Peace for the Middle East, it's a beautiful phrase, and we hope it's going to come true, but it's very close, and they're doing very well. We have a great team over there, great negotiators, and there are unfortunately great negotiators on the other side also. But it's something I think that will happen, got a good chance of happening. I may go there sometime toward the end of the week, maybe on Sunday, actually, and we'll see. But there's a very good chance negotiations are going along very well. We're dealing with Hamas and many of the countries. As you know, we have all of the Muslim countries are included. All of the Arab countries are included. Very rich countries and some that are not so rich, but just about everybody's included. It's never happened before. Nothing like that's happened before. And our final negotiation, as you know, is with Hamas. And it seems to be going well. So we'll let you know.
And when he makes his announcement that this war has been ongoing for, I think it's 3,000 years, or is it 500 years? Like, the fact is, Trump, I'm not saying he doesn't have a clue, but this is his role, is to muddy the waters, to create this kind of confusion and sort of, well, okay, but, he's such an idiot, there must be some truth in it. He's not an idiot. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows how to play the audience. He knows how to distract the audience. He knows how to bamboozle the audience, right? This is all his technique. He's a businessman at the end of the day. He knows how to make a deal. He knows how to, I won't say he's a poker player. He's too obvious for that. But he knows how to play the game. He knows how to play the psychological warfare of negotiations. We saw that with Iran. And this is my fear, is we're seeing these peace negotiations, massive pressure being brought to bear, not only on Hamas, but today in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh on the coast. They were joined by the PFLP, the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Islamic Jihad, Jared Kushner's turned up, Stephen Witkoff, the Emir and the Prime Minister of Qatar, the head of intelligence from Turkey, who, of course, is also very heavily connected to the Jolani Takfiri regime in Syria. In fact, he very much managed the operations for HTS prior to the coup, particularly in Idlib. They were working hand in glove on the intelligence operations in Idlib before December 2024. So this is massive pressure on the resistance factions from Palestine, whose people have been genocided in some of the most brutal, horrific, horrendous, grotesque ways for the last 2 years. And of course, before that, for the last 100 years, right? And they're being asked to de-radicalize and disarm, excuse me. Who should be de-radicalizing and disarming? Russia's very happy to say that Nazis in Ukraine should disarm and de-radicalize. But nothing's being said by Russia or by China or by the majority of BRICS countries, as we've discussed, except for, of course, for Iran and South Africa, about this fact that this entity is committing genocide. Yet nobody's demanding that it withdraws to the 47 borders. I'm not even going to talk about the 67 borders. You know, they were illegally imposed in 1948. So in reality, Palestine should be restored to the 1947 borders, and those with dual nationalities should leave. But the fact is that this peace deal in the media and social media is being blown out of all proportion, and this actually makes me really worry. Why? Because ultimately, Hamas is not going to accept disarmament. It's not going to accept the rule of Palestine by international agencies led by, for example, by Tony Blair, whose record as an infanticidal lunatic in the Middle East, of course, particularly in Iraq, but even as Middle East envoy, he was responsible for much of the Zionist policy. He's in bed with the Zionists, effectively. So there are multiple sticking points, and the only focus for Trump and Netanyahu right now are the hostages, the release of the hostages. You have, what's his name? Sorry, I've just forgotten it. The chief of staff of the IOF basically saying, look, you know, there's no ceasefire. We're just going to change our operational tactics right now. But if the political situation fails, if the talks fail, then we're back on again. Smotrich and Ben Gvir are pushing for assurances that if the political discussions fail, they can finish Hamas. All of them in their language are saying that Hamas has to be destroyed. In the interview that Netanyahu did with Ben Shapiro, that's what he's saying. We will smash Hamas. Even if we haven't succeeded right now, we'll continue doing it. This isn't a man that's looking for peace. No. And this isn't a man that wanted the hostages out from day one. On the 9th and 10th of October, Hamas had already offered to release the hostages, and the government refused. And this has happened multiple times. And we see this time and time and time again. You know, Trump lured General Soleimani and Mohandes from the Iraqi resistance to their deaths in 2020. He lured Iran into a false sense of security on negotiations when Israel suddenly attacked. And my fear is that this is another trap, effectively. And the fallout from it is going to be even greater than before. And that's what we're bracing for here in this region. And that's what everyone on social media, except for kind of local regional commentators, are ignoring. And that's why it needs to be talked about, Fee, because no one's paying attention to what is actually going on. They're getting caught up in the details. Marco Rubio is supposed to be heading to Paris, I think it's today, for a parallel meeting with European and Arab Gulf Zionist bloc countries as to what happens to Gaza post-ceasefire deal. Now, notice how it's suddenly become a ceasefire deal, not a peace deal, in the rhetoric that's being put out in the media and from the official statements, right? President Sisi has invited Trump to come and be present at the signing of the ceasefire deal, according to the reports that I've seen. I haven't verified them, but he calls it a ceasefire deal. He doesn't call it a peace deal. So see how the language is suddenly changing, right? So for me, this is just another. It's another trap. It's another psychological war against the resistance, the entire axis. It's a psychological war against the supporters of Palestine, because it's very easy to take your foot off the accelerator and think, oh, okay, there's a peace deal upcoming, then everything can stop. The bombing hasn't stopped. The killing hasn't stopped. The interception of the latest flotilla has just happened, right? There's still activists that were on board the first flotilla that are still being held in the Israeli high security prisons. And we also have to remember historically, when the PLO under Arafat in the late 70s with the Camp David Agreement and then the Oslo agreements and so on, when they decided to disarm, what happened? In 1982, there was the massacre of Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon. It was through the phalangists, who were acting as proxies of Israel, But you have a similar situation in Gaza right now, because you have the ISIS elements that have been weaponized and deployed by Israel, actually partnered by Israel, to effectively infiltrate Gazan society and turn against Hamas and kill Palestinians, for example, trying to reach the aid depots such as they are right now. So, I mean, I'd be interested in your opinion, but for me, and we'll come on to what Netanyahu said in his interview with Ben Shapiro, and how that also indicates to me that this is not a peace deal. This is just the next step. And remembering what happened when they achieved a ceasefire, and when Israel rushed into a ceasefire with Hezbollah, and everyone was kind of scratching their heads. And I actually said they'll pivot to Syria, but nobody knew to what extent the pivot was going to be towards Syria. And I have some theories about what's going to happen in Iraq, but I'd like to get, your point of view on what I've said, and also how you view the ongoing so-called peace talks.
Yeah, well, it feels to me that everything surrounding the peace talks has been effectively PR and propaganda for not just the Trump administration, but to pacify the obvious disdain that there is against Israel, the obvious pushback and rising hate on Israel, because it's gotten to the point where even in U.S. media, it's become more profitable for people to speak out against Israel, not necessarily for the right reasons, right? Because these people never talk about the resistance. They never talk about the US's anti-imperialist role, but they touch on, how Israel is terrible and how Israel controls America. So effectively, what I think the Trump administration is doing is, in a way, separating itself, trying to act as if they are not fully in line with the basically Netanyahu's plan, basically the Zionist plan for the final solution. And everything that the Trump administration has been doing in terms of utilizing Israeli intelligence, in terms of utilizing Netanyahu's plan, utilizing the expansionist policies by Israel, has effectively built upon that final solution. He has never once swayed and tried to genuinely work something out that would be considered even remotely a two-state solution. We know that that's effectively a dying solution. It's irrelevant. But what I'm saying is that there seems to be a PR plan acknowledging that many people from the American perspective within MAGA have turned on Israel. And therefore, this is why you're seeing the obsession with the Charlie Kirk thing, because there's a mechanism there to free Trump from any culpability. Trump has been labeled this victim that is just incapable of, quote unquote, standing up to Netanyahu. And what you said earlier is true. Trump is not in that way, Trump is not an idiot. He's a businessman. He knows exactly what he's doing, and everything that he's doing aligns with his business interests in the region. Because, as you mentioned, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is a part of this whole thing. I mean, the Kushners are entirely a part of this whole thing. He has Zionist ties, not just in his administration, but within his family. And so when people try to build this narrative that this is a real thing, that the United States is going to protect Palestine, that this is going to be over, what I think it's meant to affect and pacify the Palestinian activists, the pro-Palestinian people. It's meant to give some sort of false hope, because in that false hope, you're going to have the foot, as you said, off the accelerator. You're going to have people focus on that and on the good that can be. People think that they can reform this, that they can still maybe count on politicians to do something. You just had the Zoran Mamdani guy, who so many people were still pushing as of recently. This is so dumb that I'm even mentioning this, but people who have influence in U.S. politics, podcasters, journalists, whatever, pushing him as a viable candidate for the Palestinian, pro-Palestinian resistance, or not resistance, but activists. And so they were saying that if he becomes the mayor of New York, he's going to arrest Netanyahu, which is completely flabbergasting, which is completely it's absolutely ridiculous. That would never happen. But in what does he do? He goes and denounces Hamas. He goes and attacks Hamas. He goes and basically separates the genocide from the resistance. And this is my problem with the Western pro-Palestinian movement, the way they talk about Gaza and the way they talk about Palestinians is they don't talk about the resistance, or they minimize it, or they vilify it, instead of understanding that it's the fundamental part of the whole thing. And they do this in order to placate to the Zionism and in the government, and in order to also, because they also genuinely still at their core see Hamas as potential terrorists. I mean, a lot of these people that are saying Israel this, Israel that, will not give credence to Hamas or credence to the resistance, because they don't believe in that. They believe that they are villains still. And so people need to understand that that's why we talk about this stuff, because there is a difference between people who are constantly aware of the resistance, know how the resistance operates, know what is actually happening at the local level, you in the region, versus what, people who are just creating theories based on what somebody else that they esteem is saying. And so this whole thing for me has felt very theatrical, very manipulated, and just put out there to make people either feel completely disillusioned, like that, nothing good will come about it, or make people feel like there's hope in this and we need to trust in Donald Trump and what he's doing, and that he's the first president that's even trying this and that sort of thing. So I think that's also in an effort to cloud people's awareness of what we're talking about, of the attacks that are coming from Netanyahu do point to Iran, but they also point to just the region in general. The pivoting that you talked about into Syria is important to note, because there's a reason why, if there is a lack of focus on Palestine, or a seeming lack of focus, if there is going to be a shift, which we will know will only be temporary, there is somewhere else that they're going to go to, right? And that's where people aren't looking, because that's the whole point. And they're so caught up in these little dramas and all the theatrical displays that the actors are putting out before us, that they're not seeing, okay, what are we missing here? Why, for example, why is all this stuff on Israel happening now? Why are people like Matt Gaetz, who have been extremely pro-Israel, people who have been pro-Israel in the past, suddenly talking about Israel as being the villain? And from my perspective, it seems to me not just awareness that happens naturally and evolution of the mind, but it seems to be a very opportunistic narrative management going on that is trying to divide the culpability and the complicity of the United States within Israel and what they're doing, versus making it a victim that is just helpless and is also fighting Israel. And I think that's purposeful, because the United States likes to do this when they want to use proxies, or when they want to wash their hands off of something that is coming, an incoming false flag, that they can easily say, we had nothing to do with this. We didn't do it. We have nothing to do with it. And people are once again falling for that tactic that they use every single time. We can go back to 9/11, by the way, and people who say it was only Israel that did it. Israel did it. Well, it wasn't only Israel. The United States knew full well
exactly
what was going on. So again, I've been seeing more and more this overall attempt to relieve the United States, Washington, the deep state, the intelligence apparatus that drives our country, away from any role that it has, when it has had the pivotal role. And we are also seeing this happen to another extent that I'm sure we'll mention, with China and Russia. Like, we are seeing this attempt to say, oh, they're trying to defeat them. They're trying to defeat them they're trying to defeat the West. So therefore, they have to continue trading and having a relationship with Israel. You know, Vladimir Putin has to continue having conversations, phone conversations and meetings with the Zionist regime, including Netanyahu. I'm just at a loss for how people just, the mental gymnastics it takes to justify all of this.
Well, actually, I found it quite interesting that there were largely unsubstantiated narratives around the rift between China and Israel. And that's actually what kind of set the alarm bells off first, because I thought, okay, this is interesting, because this is textbook, let's provide plausible deniability, right? So I don't think it's only for the United States. And what worries me is the level of charade that is playing out means for me that there is something major in the pipeline. And I think there's an indication of that for sure in the Ben Shapiro interview with Netanyahu. And you mentioned the fact that he lists off the American cities that could be targeted by, that are basically under the Iranian atomic guns.
Iran is developing now ballistic missiles that are intercontinental ballistic missiles for 8,000 kilometer range. What does that mean? They add another 3,000 kilometers, and they've got under their atomic guns, the New York City in target, Washington, Boston, Miami, Mar-a-Lago. Okay? So that is a very great danger. You don't want to be under the nuclear gun of these people who are not necessarily rational and who chant death to America.
So first of all, he says, look, we've smashed Iran, we've smashed Iran's nuclear capabilities. But hang on, no, they have atomic missile capabilities, and they're extending the range. And that can basically include, as you said, Trump's hometown, Miami, Washington, New York, et cetera, right? So that's number one. So there is potential for an incoming false flag. We also have to look at the timing. Traditionally, they're not going to be looking at any kind of major operation in the winter months because it's too difficult for them. So if you look at here, for example, the winter months really begin, I would say, the end of November, December. So that means we've got October, November. If not, we're in next year, which wouldn't be January, it could be February, and then we've got the midterm elections. So in my opinion, we've got either a very imminent ramping up or escalation against the entire resistance axis, because I don't think it's only against Iran this time. And then the other thing which I found, again, very concerning, one is how cocky Netanyahu was in this interview. I mean, he's not a man that thinks that they're beaten and down and out. And yeah, for sure, you know, he has a huge degree of hubris. But this is a man who knows that something else is going on behind the scenes. And even when he talks about his relationship with Trump, and he's kind of, you know, cracking jokes with Ben Shapiro about it's like being with your wife, and, you know, you might disagree with some things, but at the end of the day, blah, 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 right? So this is not a man who has any concerns about the US backing him in whatever he wants to do. And then he talks about the defensive and the offensive capabilities of Israel. And again, he jokes with Ben Shapiro and he says, yeah, no, America knows about our offensive capabilities, but I'm not going to share it with you. Now, one thing that just came into my mind, and I've been talking to certain people here and in Syria about it, and we're kind of in agreement about it, which is very worrying, is the US has been withdrawing all of its troops from Iraq. They've been pushing the Iraqi resistance to disarm, just as they've been doing with Hezbollah, and they failed. And there is a huge degree of frustration from particularly Tom Barrack, Trump's point man in the Middle East, who's been getting increasingly frustrated, particularly in Lebanon, with really the lack of action or obedience to the US playbook, which is effectively to disarm Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance and to leave it completely open to whatever Israel wants to do in Lebanon, which of course is to expand into the southern territory. Of course, they will go further. And I was actually looking into the history of not only, obviously, Israel has been developing nuclear weapon capability. I think it has something like 200. The estimates vary between, I don't know, 150 and more than 200. But the other more worrying aspect, and actually Netanyahu again makes reference to it in basically saying, oh, as if we would poison wells, as if we would use chemical weapons. Well, of course they have. From 1948 onwards, that's what they've been doing. And they've used white phosphorus, which has contaminated the land. Even the current genocide with the amount of potentially uranium and depleted uranium and so on that is now in the surface of the planet in Gaza is insane. They've been throwing sewage into the sea off the coast of Gaza from the very beginning. It's so polluted. The number of viruses there is insane. They have the potential to be able to put whatever they want, whatever virus, whatever bacteria into the water, because they control all the supply of water into Gaza and into actually much of the occupied territories, as you know. And I was kind of looking deeper into this, and I found a paper from 2001 on the chemical weapons non-proliferation in Israel. And in this paper, they talk about how in 1948, David Ben-Gurion actually used the Jewish agency in the EU to scout for a East European scientist who would come, and this is from Ben-Gurion, to increase the capacity to kill masses or cure masses. Both are important. And funnily enough, they found a colonel in the Red Army, Avraham Marcus Klinberg, who then went on to found and become the director of the Israeli Institute of Biological Research, which is 12 miles southeast of Tel Aviv. So my fear is right now, and again, talking to people here, they have the same fear that he's going to move up a step. Like, this isn't going to be normal kinetic warfare. Like, he needs to finish the job now, right? Why are US troops suddenly, after years of negotiations with the Iraqi government, why now are they suddenly, literally, in all of them, leaving northeast Syria and Iraq? Is there potential for Israel to use bioweapons in Iraq? Yes, I think so. I think there's a very strong potential, even here in Lebanon, right? Because I think, unfortunately, with all of the kind of hype around this peace deal, all of the hype from across the board, from all the captured Arab nations, the Zionist bloc Arab nations, from all the European nations who are banging on about two-state solution and even held the kind of conference at the UN, which we also talked about. Even Putin at the Valdai Club, when he was asked about the Trump deal, who basically gave it the green light, not only gave it the green light, he praised Tony Blair and talked about how he used to share coffee in his pajamas with him at his residence and so on, right? I mean, this was just shocking for me, because he approves a peace deal, and people will say to us, yeah, but, Russia and China are in direct conversation with Hamas and PA, Mahmoud Abbas, and so on. And there's an upcoming Arab-Russian summit, which, by the way, the Takfiris in Syria are guests of honor, right? And yet here he is basically agreeing to a peace deal without the approval of either Hamas. Okay, maybe understandable, but not even, because in the deal, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is also out of the picture, right? They're completely sidelined. They're not going to have any access to governance in Gaza until they go through a reform program. So he's accepting this. His so-called allies that he's invited to Moscow for talks, now he's completely discounting their opinion on the Trump plan. Why? Is he trying to score points with Trump? Is he trying to score points with Tony Blair? Is Lavrov trying to score points with Trump by saying, yeah, we're not worried about the Tomahawk missiles, you know, bad Europe, good US, we can rely on Trump, which is what I took away from his response about the threat of the EU supplying US Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. It feels very weird to me. It feels like, I don't want to say everyone's on board, but I feel like nobody is seeing the pitfalls. Nobody is seeing, or if they are seeing, they're accepting of what comes next.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you pointed out the Putin thing, because so many people read that as, wow, Putin is just clowning. He's just making fun of it was like, but that's not what I got. I got a praise.
No.
Like I took it the same way you did. And this reminds me of the whole reformed terrorists, or not terrorists anymore, that he said before.
Oh, yeah.
If you remember
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
It was like,
after Syria
'cause-
fell. Yeah.
yeah, but to me, it's the same kind of thing. And like, it's different double speak than, say, like an American would do it, or, you know, a European.
Mm.
But that doesn't mean that he's not doing that he's not kind of saying something without saying something. And I think so many people have a confirmed bias of a positivity towards Putin, that they took that in the wrong way, as just making fun of the guy, but he was actually praising him and Trump. So for me, it was like, it felt like
well,
the
and
whole
also
thing,
he was approving of the peace plan, which is extraordinary because the details of it had not been even, the negotiations hadn't even begun at that point. So he's accepting a peace plan, which basically deprives the Palestinian people of any agency, disarms the Palestinian people while they're trying to defend themselves, you know, against disproportionate force and a genocidal entity. I mean, this was, you know, there wasn't any condemnation of what Israel was doing. And then just back to the default two-state solution. Yeah, I know.
Well, yeah, because that, again, we're talking about the default two-state solution that both China and Russia stand by, and that they whenever they are confronted upon that, especially in the last few times, I think that Putin was asked on Russia, on the two-state solution between Palestine and Israel, he specifically said that they believe in this two-state solution. Whenever he's even asked about, does he believe in the existence of the Israeli state, he pivots to the two-state solution. And that's telling to me, because you're effectively saying that you believe Israel, yes, has the right to exist. You believe that Israel should have a government and should exist despite everything that they're doing. And that's not going to change.
Exist as it is.
Russia.
Exist as it is. He doesn't talk about even the 67 borders. For me, that's not enough. It should go back to the 47 borders. But, you know, there's never any discussion of what this two-state solution actually looks like. This is the thing. It's just like a kind of a tagline that they roll out every time that they're asked about this. And I just posted on my channel where someone also asked Putin what he thought about the Israel bombing Qatar. He doesn't even answer, he just shrugs. Now, for me, yeah, people are going to dismiss this as like, well, you know, why should he care? Well, yeah, he should care because Israel just violated international law. And if you're talking about peace negotiations, again, the Hamas officials were lured by Trump into Qatar to conduct peace negotiations, and then they're bombed. That, if you're a world leader, that is what you should be condemning. But to just shrug it, it's almost like, yeah, well, just a few more Arabs. Literally, that's how it came across to me.
I don't know if he has been asked this before, because I thought he was asked and he answered, but his answer was just very off-putting.
He answered, but it was kind of, I'm not surprised. He said, I'm not surprised. And he just shrugged. You know, that's it. But like I said, you know, if you're a, no, you know, if he's the president, if anyone should have an idea of where you stand as regards international law on that attack, even if you don't mention the fact that Trump lured them there and then had Israel bomb them, right? Which is Trump's sort of MO, as we've said. That's what he did with Soleimani and General Mohandas. And who knows what happened with President Raisi, where they lured into Azerbaijan for talks about whatever they were talking about, etc. We've mentioned this before also. So for me, that was extraordinary. And it was also an opportunity. If Russia and China are these sort of ideological counters to Western imperialism, that was an ideal opportunity for him to say, yeah, well, what do you expect? These are US tactics. This is what they do. This was the perfect opportunity, but it didn't happen.
Well, yeah, and then you mentioned the Russia Arab summit, right? And the thing,
Yes.
and the thing with Russia, not just accepting Jelani, but welcoming it with a red carpet, and they're rolling out the red
new
carpet. They
era.
have been doing that with we should have known. I mean, I think we did know, but with their actions towards Saudi Arabia, with their actions towards the Gulf, this isn't surprising that they would go this route. But I think for a lot of people that were denying their involvement in the fall of Syria, this might have been, I think, more difficult for them to take. And the other thing that I want to point out in Valdai as to what Putin was saying is he kept praising the Trump administration. He kept praising Trump in general, and vilifying or denouncing Europe, which is expected, obviously. But the other thing there is that there seems to be a push towards a NATO EU war with Russia, where the United States is yet again, separating itself from that.
Yeah.
Right? Where they're saying, Trump's saying, well, we'll give the money and the weapons to the EU. They can decide what they do with it. So it's like they're sort of washing their hands off the whole thing and pretending that they weren't the ones that instigated the entire thing in 2014 and even before. So again, these are very, very usual, normal things that the U.S. intel apparatus does all the time when it comes to them trying to wash their hands off of conflict before something else happens. So the footprints, the positions, all of these signs, these red flags are there. And I think people are missing them because they're trying to still promote this idea that Trump is going to solve the problems, that Trump is going to come in and clean house. And even when I look at Putin's reaction to this, I have a hard time thinking he's playing 5D chess and is going to somehow come back at Trump and outsmart him and
No, he's not.
Really.
He didn't in 2016. Exactly.
Yeah.
If you look back in 2016, it was the same scenario. And what I find, sorry, just to butt in on the Russia Arab summit, because this is a very important point, and we talked about this the other day. Now, when President Assad was either forcibly removed or he was, there are differing narratives on this from people close to the palace in Damascus. Many are saying that he was taken out in handcuffs, he was forced to go by Russia, and others are saying something else. Anyway, one day we will know the whole truth, perhaps. But it always struck me as very odd that they only gave him humanitarian asylum.
Yeah.
Now, I looked at the difference between humanitarian and political asylum in Russia. Political asylum is like hardly ever given. It has to be given, as we know, through presidential decree, and people have to have a rock solid reason for not being able to go back to their own country, which would mean death, persecution, imprisonment over political reasons, and so on. Now, and under political asylum, if I understand it correctly, you get refugee status, which of course gives you advantages in the sense that you eventually get a Russian passport, you can enter the labor system and so on and so forth. Humanitarian asylum is much more restrictive. So a president of a country who was an ally of Russia under Putin's leadership from 2000 onwards, when he came in, only gets given humanitarian asylum. This always struck me as very strange, right? Then we know that Giuliani, in the first meetings with the Russians, which was very quick after the fall of Damascus, I think, again, we've spoken about this, it was within 6 weeks that Bogdanov, the deputy foreign minister, went to Damascus and had meetings with Giuliani, and since then they've been backwards and forwards to Moscow. Both the both co-founders of Al Qaeda, namely Asad al-Shaibani and Mohammed al-Jilani, or Ahmed al-Sharaa, whatever you want to call him, have been backwards and forwards to Moscow. And you're absolutely right; they're being given the red carpet treatment at the summit. There are statements from Russian officials talking about a new era of collaboration with Syria. I mean, bigging up the partnership, the economic partnership with effectively Al Qaeda that just ran the most corrupt election in history. But, you know, the West is bringing democracy and all that. And then we return to the subject of Assad, because I've been seeing reports in Arabic that basically, so just before the Russian-Arab summit, the court case has been brought against Assad, demanding his arrest for prosecution for war crimes back in 2012, when all the propaganda began in Daraa in the south of Syria. And there are statements from a number of officials saying, well, you know, we don't think Putin's going to release Assad to us, but, you know, we also don't know what might happen in the future because we're discussing possibilities and so on. So the narrative has shifted from, in the beginning, Russia saying, no, Assad is a red line, to now officials in Syria saying, yeah, we don't think Putin right now is going to agree to it, but, you know, we're pursuing this avenue of prosecution and investigation into his crimes, and we'll be talking about it further down the road, right? So I mean, genuinely, I hope they don't, because when you see how the Takfiris have been treating former military commanders, and even the Sunni Muslim former Grand Mufti, who's been hideously tortured, and now there are rumors that him and 3 others are about to be executed. He was a man of peace. He forgave the Takfiri elements that murdered his own son very early on in the conflict. He always called for reunification of all Syrians, etc., etc. But again, Russia would know who he is. The Russians who were in Syria from 2015 knew the Grand Mufti, Hassoun, very well. But that's what I'm saying. They're not doing anything in return. They could easily, in my opinion, negotiate with Giuliani for his release, for example. He's a man of faith. He wasn't a member of intelligence forces. He wasn't a member of the military. He didn't, as far as I know, commit any crimes against the Syrian people. In fact, he was responsible for the release of many of the prisoners from the prisons, those that had been in the early protests and so on. Their families were released, and many of the young men were released, right? There's video evidence of this. So I just find it extraordinary that it's almost as if Russia has just said, okay, Assad, Syria, we draw a line. Now we're dealing with the Takfiris, and we're going to consolidate our presence. We'll collaborate with Israel because we always had the friendship anyway. You know, now we can just bring it to the fore. We don't have to kind of play cat and mouse anymore. We don't have to keep both sides happy. Now we can just openly partner with Israel in Syria, which is what they're doing. And if we have to, you know, make the most of the Takfiri regime until it's replaced by something else, then we'll do that because it serves our purpose. And that's my point. people are projecting their own ideology or their own desire to see an ideology reflected back at them from these countries, in my opinion, right?
Yeah.
And we've talked about this time and time and time again. I don't really blame Russia for what it's doing. I don't like it, but I don't expect anything else from them. I don't expect them to be some kind of ideological heavyweight positioning itself against all the wrongs in the world and against the imperialist colonialist powers. Israel is, of course, one of those, or at least it's a weapon of the Zionist movement, which is in control of the US, UK, and EU governments largely, right? So I don't see Russia or China acting out any kind of ideological adherence or alliance to any kind of resistance movement, unless those partnerships are to their advantage. I mean, yes, they are doing some deals with Ansarullah, for example, but they're minor compared to what they're doing with Saudi Arabia. But they're both just keeping their foot in each camp, right? Like in Syria, I know that Russia is in conversations with former government members and officials. And there is talk that there may be some kind of uprising in the coastal region against Jolani. But that's because that would give Russia the ability to consolidate and increase its presence in the coast, right? It's not because Russia is thinking, yeah, we'll support the resistance against the Takfiris because that's the right thing to do. No. It's only if it serves its interests. And I think when we kind of accept that, then it's actually quite liberating, because then we can work from the basis that there's only the armed resistance. There's only individuals like the flotilla people, like Palestine Action, like ourselves, who can actually do everything in our power to change or to challenge or confront what is happening in the world today, but not relying on them to help unless it serves their purpose. And I guess that's part of the realpolitik game. And Syed Nasrallah, before his assassination, spoke about this. You know, he said, Russia is not an ally. We appreciate what they've done in our interest, but we don't consider them an ally. We just consider them as a country that we can work with, for sure. But we understand where Russia positions us in their priorities, let's say.
And this is an important distinction to make, because all we see from Valdai, from the past Russia Arab summits, from BRICS, from all of these places, is people putting their own idea, their own confirmation bias into how Russia or China are acting, and saying that they're acting this way because they are opposing the West, and they want to oppose the West by helping all of these other countries. And it's just not real. Because if you understand the Russian government, and I'm speaking solely about the government, if you understand the Russian government and how they're acting right now, everything they've done is to advance their own interests. And they even say it. They blatantly have stated it as such, that they're trying to expand their interests, trying to expand their economic foothold, that they're trying to build coalitions with everybody. Even BRICS has said that we're not an anti-Western bloc, that we are essentially just trying to build something else. And again, this is why I think for people who think BRICS and this multipolar world order is going to be a different world that is going to be full of justice and full of just equity, that are going to be largely disappointed, because that's just not the case. That's not what they're fighting for. And you can tell by the fact that Israel exists, by the fact that Israel is still not being ostracized or excluded or completely just attacked by very powerful people, very powerful states. And if it were, then you could see an ideology behind doing things for the good, because it's the right thing to do, because it's simply the moral thing to do. But that's not what's driving these very pragmatic, business minded decisions coming from China and Russia. And again, the decision for Russia to have normalization with the United States is also coming from economic interests in the Arctic. Like, it's coming from economic interest in Donbass. It's coming from having that ability to have a normal relationship in that way. It's not coming from a desire to just have kumbaya with Washington. It's, again, like, all of these things, which way you take it, are being driven by pragmatic realities. And when people just, what we're getting in the media all the time, from independent media, from alternative media, whatever you want to call it, is just a bunch of, Russia and China are taking on the US hegemony and they're doing this and that. Look how China's going after Israel with the diamond industry. Look at this and that. It's like, there's nothing behind it. It's all fluff. It's PR. It's not real.
By the way, as someone pointed out to me, the greatest casualty from China's synthetic diamond industry is Russia. So,
Yeah.
so let's get away from the kind of Western, the foundations of Western power are being shaken by China's synthetic diamond industry. No, it's Russia, actually.
Yeah. No,
Sorry,
yeah, you're right.
I interrupted.
No, no, the diamond industry in Russia was a huge thing. By the way. But I feel like we have to constantly talk about this, because it's not just because we're attacked for even saying this, but it's because I think it will be important. You're right, it's liberating, but it's also gives us the ability to weaponize that understanding in an effort to finally stop believing that somebody, whether it's Russia, China, Greta, or whoever is, Candace Owens is going to save us. I mean, it's too much to put on one person. And two, it's just not feasible. That's not how things work, right? That's not how you're not going to have one person save the world. It's impossible at this point to do that. And people create these saviors, like Vladimir Putin is going to take on, all the entirety of the West. And when we talk about Russia taking on NATO, they're fighting NATO, yes, but are they fighting NATO because of the ideological hegemony within NATO, or are they fighting NATO because NATO is infringing upon their interests, right? And that's the reality. You can go back to proving this, by the way. If you go back to Donbass in 2014, and the criticism from many within the Russian government contingent against Putin from the left, why he wouldn't go in. And the reason he said was because Russia wasn't ready to do so.
Yeah.
It wasn't because it was like that they couldn't. It was because they weren't ready. And so the thing is, for me, that says that it's not the pragmatic decision to make, despite the fact that Russians were getting killed for years. So it took basically like 9 years for Russia to finally go in. Was it because they were avoiding what would ultimately be a greater war? Perhaps. And that was perhaps the pragmatic decision, notwithstanding the fact that thousands and thousands of Russians, including children, were being killed. And that didn't do it. That wasn't a good enough reason to go in at that moment. If the pragmatics of the reality didn't align. And so, yeah, we can't expect governments to necessarily function as sentient beings like humans that don't have so much, I guess, of the entirety of the world looking at them. But at the same time, then let's not put that idea that that's how they are into a reality. Is that just isn't, like, if Russia is not that, fine, but don't pretend that it is, because then we're not really talking about anything. We're talking about our wishes and our desires and our hopes and dreams, but we're not talking about the reality of what's happening. And I guess
we're just abrogating responsibility. And I think
yeah,
the other important thing for people to understand is that the resistance axis doesn't count on Russia or China, by the way.
Yeah.
When I talk about Russia or China here, they just shrug. They're like, yeah, we know what they are. And for them, because people throw it at me, yeah, but China. Well, I love this kind of China is helping Yemen. Okay, which Yemen? Are you talking the Sana Ansarullah coalition government, which is leading the resistance against Israel and to prevent the genocide? Or are you talking about Aden in the south, which you can choose from, the UAE so-called government, the Saudi puppet regime, which is the internationally recognized by Russia and China, by the way. So they don't even recognize the Ansarullah government, and China signed off on them being declared a terrorist organization. Just to be clear, UN Resolution 2624 and UN Resolution 2216. 2216 enables the blockade of 27 million Yemenis from 2015 onwards, and 2624 was the UN resolution to declare Ansarullah a terrorist organization, and China approved it. And so did Russia, by the way. Russia abstained on 2216, which is the blockade, but both of them recognized the Saudi puppet regime. And then added to that, you have the Muslim Brotherhood factions in the south. So you have three to choose. You have four Yemeni options to choose from. And yet people will say to me, yeah, but China's helping Yemen. It's like, okay, can you be a little bit clearer on that? Because yes, they're for sure helping the Saudi puppet regime, and they've been helping them since 2015. And they've been stealing oil from Yemen through the Saudi puppet regime at low prices, with no money being given to the Sana'a government to keep the salaries running for the majority of Yemenis in northern Yemen, right? So people need to be an awful lot clearer about what they're talking about. And the thing is that how the resistance perceive China and Russia, and I think it's much healthier than how Westerners perceive them, Westerners who are kind of captured by this whole BRICS romance thing. The resistance perceive them as a counter to the West from a realistic perspective. So, like, for example, Iran is under sanctions. So, of course, it's going to deal with Russia and China. Right? It's not going to look to deal with the West. This is logical.
Yeah.
Doesn't necessarily mean that Iran perceives Russia as an ideological partner. And again, I was having a discussion very recently with someone who was here for the 1 year since the assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah. And he's in Iran, and he was saying the same thing to me. He said, no, we're very realistic about Russia. We don't expect anything from them. We maintain a policy of strategic independence, but at the same time, it's better to keep relations sweet with China and Russia, because ultimately we're going to need them, right? So that's how the resistant looks at it, which in my opinion is very realistic.
Yeah.
But they know what they are. That's the point. They know what they're dealing with. We don't in the West. We haven't quite cottoned onto it yet. So we're still living in this kind of other dimension. I don't know how to describe it. But it's not a very real dimension. It's a bit of a Truman
It's the hopium
dimension. Yeah.
The hopium dimension, where it's just
and I'm not mocking people. I'm not being dismissive or so on. But I'm just saying it's maybe good to learn from how the actual armed resistance views them, because they're ultimately the ones who are closest to them to a large degree from an economic trade policy point of view. And there are huge failings from them in that aspect, right? Which are recognized and accepted, but we don't even recognize them.
Well, it's easy to view Russia or China as something that they're not when we haven't really understood like what is actually going on. We tend in the West, particularly speaking from the United States, view things as black and white in terms of hero and villain, in dualities,
Yeah.
in terms of this very much like, you know, Superman versus the evil villain, instead of just like looking at things as they are. And we turn to make characters into stereotypical impossibilities that don't exist in the reality of our world. So we're conditioned from birth to look at this. I mean, Hollywood is a very, very good example of how that works and how that's formulated. So it is almost impossible for an American to not look, if you're opposing the West, you then absolutely have to allow everything China does or everything Russia does or everything X state does as being good. If we're opposing Zionism, then that means every person speaking out against Zionism is doing a good thing, even if they're doing it for multiple reasons, and the motivations have stopped mattering. So when you look at things like that, you're looking for heroes, you're looking for people to save you, you're looking for this idea that you're imposing your fears and your insecurities and your psychological traumas on these very real and pragmatic logical situations that are existing that have nothing to do with that. It's a form of learned helplessness. It's a form of just literally not knowing what to do and not having the desire to do something about it, or having the fear that you can't do something about it. So let's put it on somebody else. And that's essentially what we do with every single thing that comes out, with every story, every figure. If you notice, like the things that are talked about in media, whether alternative, independent, or mainstream, it always focuses on the character of the person. And if they're doing something that is counter to the accepted narrative. And so they base it off of that. So, for example, you can't have nuance in a lot of these conversations. And so when we go to the, supposed anti-Western left in the United States or whatever, you can't really criticize China or Russia because they're sovereign countries, and we don't want to do that because that means that we're putting our own Americanized, dictatorial version of how pro-democracy they should be. But there's no nuance in that. And if you hate Russia and China, then yes, you can criticize them all you want, but that's because you hate Russia and China and you're, a
But I don't think it's about hating them, is it? It's about their policies.
It's not.
It's
Yeah,
about
it's
being
about
critical
talking
of their policies
as they
So
are.
it's not personal.
In reality. No, it's not. So, but there's a personal attachment put into taking on these positions. Is what I'm saying. Like they put these in, like I posted a video the other day on X where I shared this saying I guess China's creating these, what do they call them, like kind of like drones, but I don't know, they're calling them like exoskeletons of sorts.
I saw
to
that,
fight war.
Yeah.
And so I said, this isn't good in general, because like it's like, we're creating robots and drones, like, into a scientific future where we're seeing like, humans essentially become collateral damage to all of these things that are coming out, whether it's going to be a biological weapon, as you were mentioning, which is extremely possible, or more drone warfare, but with like robots taking over, robots that are machines, so they're not going to hesitate to kill an innocent person. They might not differentiate. These are very, very dark and nefarious things that are actually already happening. And because it was China doing it and a Chinese account spreading something very positive about this, people were saying, and I said, this isn't good. None of this is something to cheer for. And they were saying, oh, but I would rather it China than us. Or they were saying like, well, I understand why China would do it. And it was like this sentiment of these same deadly weapons are going to be better in the hands of China, maybe, but that's not the point. The point is this shouldn't be happening at all. We shouldn't
No,
be,
because
this
it's
isn't
still an
something to cheer
arms
for.
race. It's still, yeah.
Right.
Because if China develops it, then America will develop it. So effectively, that's what you're creating. You're just creating this endless cycle of development of things that kill us, basically.
Yeah.
And
And why are you happy about
surely, exactly. I mean, again, I was having that conversation here with someone about, should Iran have nuclear or not, and blah, blah, blah. And, they said to me, well, the fact is that we're against nuclear. Nobody wants nuclear. I mean, this is horrible. It's horrific that these weapons have even been developed, right? And the damage, our lives are over if it turns into a nuclear war.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a reason that the DPRK has not been attacked.
Dismantled, yeah.
Right. So and that's the point. We just seem to be in this endless cycle of developing these terrifying things that really are the end of mankind. And why on earth would you be happy about that? And I like that you said in one response, look, I'm not a pacifist. That's a Western privilege as far as I'm concerned. If you've never faced an occupying force like the Zionist entity or so on, then please don't say, you're against war, you're a pacifist and so on. The people here don't have any choice.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
It's fight or be exterminated. That's it. If Hamas were not in Gaza tomorrow, it would already be finished. They would find something else to use as a pretext for effectively ethnically cleansing the people of Gaza and the people of the West Bank. And by the way, since the peace deal talks came into effect, I've noticed that they're ramping up also the effectively the cleansing of areas in the West Bank, which again is going under the radar because no one's paying any attention to that at all.
Yeah. No, I mean, effectively, I think what's happening is you have people cheering for their team when it comes to a nuclear war. And it's very disturbing to see whether you think, yes, the technology would be better in the hands of Russia or China or whoever you decide is better. The point is this technology is in the hands of very powerful people, a powerful, influential global class of people that I think people need to start looking at this in terms of global power, in terms of global finance, the money, the elite groups of people that have access and have this much power over you, instead of just becoming another one in the stadium that's cheering for it and is wanting one side to win. There's no guarantee that this is a good thing for the average working person in the world. In fact, there's more of a guarantee that it isn't at all going to be a good thing. That your freedoms aren't going to be infringed upon one way or another. And what I've been seeing in Russia when I've been to these conferences, whether it was the St. Petersburg Economic Forum or BRICS or whatever, there's a push for AI within Russia. There's a push for AI within China. There's a push for AI within the United States. We're seeing it right now that, Elon Musk has effectively made a full-on
and digital
integration.
identity, biometrics, and so on.
Yeah. All of this is happening in these countries at the same time, essentially, because they are competing for these to be the winners in this race, this next fourth industrial revolution, tech arms race. And that is, of course, why you always have to go back to why the era of normalization, why are these things happening, these shifts. It's because they want the resources that are going to provide for this new era. And we're talking about the minerals, we're talking about the lithium, we're talking about the necessities, the necessary minerals required to build this tech, these computers, these microchips, and all of that. And so when you look at it from that real, not just pragmatic, but scientific way that things are operating, there is no winner when it comes to digital ID and AI and all of this, because we're essentially going to be surveilled 24/7, no matter whether you're in China, Russia, or the United States. And people don't want to face that yet. They still want to believe that the surveillance in China and Russia and the AI in China and Russia is going to be so much better than what it is in the United States. It might not be as nefarious. Like, we have seen how China, right? We talked about this, how China has lifted its people out of poverty under what cost, under what, we're not talking about what has that done. The United States did that for a time, at the cost of the entire world. And I can speak about that because I know that I am not as familiar with all of the things China has done, but I know we've talked about Africa, we've talked about Yemen, but beyond that, right? I always talk about the cost of these countries in Europe having advanced lifestyles, or all sorts of things that in the US people take for granted, the comfort levels of things, the size of houses, the size of all these, the cars and all of that. And people just, they say, well, China and Russia are going to do it differently, or they're doing it differently. Therefore, when this technology takes over, it's going to be different. We don't know the cost of that. And you're really gambling a lot here when you're trying to say that what we criticize on one end is going to be different on the other end, just because, they're against Western hegemony. It just doesn't, it's not adding up. It's not making sense. And I think ultimately people need to start looking at this on the global stage, as to, even when we talk about Israel and Zionism, that it's not just Israel, that it's not even just the United States, that, as you said way earlier, this Zionism is effectively infiltrating pretty much the majority of powers in the world right now. And this is a supremacist ideology that needs to be confronted as such, in my opinion. It needs to be confronted in the same way that you confront fascism, Nazism, but it's not. And that's the danger of it. It's being pushed onto one entity, and it's being, we're being told that Trump is a victim. We're being told that all these people are just victims, that they're not just equally as interested in that. And, there's so many conversations I want to have about the global, I would say, I don't want to say global elite only, but I want to say the global predator class, the class that is emerging in this era, that is a multinational class that has little allegiance beyond money. And I think that it's not as easy as saying they're all in on it. There's differences and intricacies in all of that, but there are aligning interests that just naturally gear them towards that level.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, when you look at the Zionist infiltration of all of these countries, I mean, I started to look into China because someone pointed out that of all the Abrahamic religions, China doesn't allow Judaism, basically. But when I looked into it, it's because historically Jews in China are considered Chinese, basically. This is how it's explained in many, viewers, our audience might have a better idea. And if they have, I'd be really fascinated, because it's something that kind of threw me slightly. But then when I started to look into it, the establishment of Shabbat Lubavitch, for example, I think in Shanghai from the late 20th century or early 21st century onwards, the increase in that influence, which then, of course, when you look at Russia, of course, Shabbat Lubavitch has a massive overreach in Russia and influence on Putin himself, but also just, generally inside Russia. So yeah, that's something that needs, I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, I haven't been looking into this all my life, but it's something that kind of piques my interest, because even when you look at Latin American countries, there are established Zionist organizations there. So their global reach is extraordinary, actually. And
Yeah.
it is something that, in my opinion, is a huge threat to the world today. And in my opinion, I don't see any evidence that China or Russia or really any of the BRICS nations, or except of course Iran, are cognizant of this or even thinking about it. In fact, it's the opposite. They're happily trading economically with the entity. Some are supplying weapons or are in collaborative weapon development partnerships, like India, for example, with Elbit Systems and so on. So that is a huge worry for me, and it's something that personally I'd like to do a lot more work on. As I said, if anyone has any of the background as to why Judaism in particular is sort of targeted for not being accepted in China, whereas Christianity and Islam is, then drop us a line and let us know, because I'd be really interested.
Yeah, all of that's very interesting, and just finding
Yeah.
more about the influence of Judaism and Zionism actually in Russia has been very
Yeah.
interesting and eye-opening as to why certain sectors operate the way they do when it comes to Israel. So,
Yeah, definitely.
well, I think that's a good way to wrap it up today, Vanessa. Hopefully, we'll be doing these more often, and hopefully, we can start, having also guests on soon. So we're looking forward to doing all of that and having very different discussions, I think, than what's out there right now. So it's always very good and cathartic to have these conversations with you, because whenever I'm in the US, I feel like it's hard to get out
I
of that.
don't envy you, actually.
So thanks everybody for joining us today for this multifaceted discussion on just all things that are happening there. As always, just keep questioning and keep really looking at things beyond what's said there. So yeah, we'll see you next time.
Bye.